I'm Diane Schanzebach, Director of the Institute for Policy Research, and it is such a great pleasure that I get to welcome friend of IPR, Adam Gamoran. He's been the president of the William T. Grant Foundation since 2013. And before that, he was the John D. MacArthur Professor in Sociology and Education Policy Studies at UW-Madison. He's elected member of the National Academy of Education, and he's a very deep thinker on inequality and schooling. He just finished chairing a National Academy panel on the future of education research for the federal government. That committee also included 2 IPR affiliates, Beth Tipton and Cynthia Coburn. And it lays a blueprint to improve the topics, the design, the training, and the funding for education research going forward. What could be more important? He's got deep Chicago roots. For better or worse, all 3 of his degrees are from our crosstown rival, but we like him anyway. He's also a Cubs fan. Not sure about that one either. But he is talking today about pursuing research on racial equity in a time of polarization. Adam, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you for those kind remarks, Diane. Mic check. You can hear me? Okay. Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and it really is a pleasure to be here at Northwestern. It's true that my degrees come from the University of Chicago, but I also have family ties here at Northwestern. 2 brothers who are graduates of Northwestern, as well as a sister and brother-in-law on the faculty at Northwestern. So, and who knows how many of my grandchildren will be students at Northwestern at some point in the future. So it's a special pleasure to be here. Also a place that I've known many members of the faculty, but particularly in sociology and also in IPR and CESP. So it's great to have the chance to come and speak to you today. I always put this little animation at the beginning to remind me to tell people, follow the William T. Grant Foundation on Twitter, follow me on Twitter. Everything I'm going to tell you today about the William T. Grant Foundation, you can find on our website, and we always announce our various competitions for funding on Twitter. The William T. Grant Foundation, founded in 1936 by William T. Grant. William T. Grant owned a lot of stores. If you're my age, you'll remember the Grant stores. There were certainly stores in the Chicago area, including downtown. Mr. Grant was frustrated. He would hire the best and brightest young men he could find to be managers of his stores, and some would work out and some wouldn't. He thought social science research was a way to help him figure out how to solve these problems. Never got an answer to his primary question. But along the way, he has supported many important studies in the social sciences, committed to understanding human behavior through research. Now, the specific challenges that the William T. Grant Foundation has supported research on have shifted over time as the pressing challenges of the day have shifted. And today, we have two main areas of focus. So the broad mission of the foundation is supporting research to improve the lives of young people. And within that broad mission, we have 2 areas of focus, which by young people, we mean those ages 5 to 25 in the United States. And the 2 focus areas are research on reducing inequality in youth outcomes and research on improving the use of evidence from research in policies and practices that affect young people. Now, I'm going to speak today about our research on reducing inequality. So I'll just say a word about the second focus area on improving the use of research evidence. This is about the science of knowledge utilization. Here we are in the business of funding research. And then the research gets written up and published and put on the shelves of a library, and that's the end of it. What have we done? We have not accomplished much. We've certainly not improved the lives of young people. So we need ways to get research in the hands of those for whom it would be useful and to see it used in policy and practice. What are the strategies? What are the barriers? What are the strategies to get evidence used? That is the focus of our focus area on improving the use of research evidence. This is not about giving funds to get evidence used. It's about studying ways to get evidence used. It's about the science of knowledge utilization. So back to reducing inequality. there are 4 reasons why the William T. Grant Foundation supports research on reducing inequality. First, levels of inequality are excessive in the United States today. And you can see this if you look at our own past history, and you can see this if you compare the United States to other Western democracies. Levels of inequality exceptionally high. In fact, I was just reading in this Sunday's New York Times, highest level of poverty among any Western democracy, strikingly higher. Of course, the expanded child tax credit pulled us back into the normal range for 1 year and 1 year alone. And now we've gone up in child poverty by about 50% from December 31st to January 1st. So exceptionally high levels of inequality. And high levels of inequality are harmful. They're a drag on our economic productivity, and they're socially divisive. But we are not paralyzed in the face of inequality. On the contrary, it's demonstrable that social programs can reduce inequality. Typically, when I give this talk, I say the war on poverty has not been won, but poverty would be a lot worse without the social policies that it brought. Now I can say we've just demonstrated that in the year gone by. We cut child poverty in half by 50%, and now it's snapped back to where it was because we implemented an expanded child tax credit and we took it away. So clearly, inequality is amenable to social poverty. Now, I'm in a room full of researchers, both in person and online. And in a room full of researchers, I don't have to convince you of my 4th point if you accept the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd, that we need research to identify programs, policies, and practices that will reduce inequality. So that's why the William T. Grant Foundation supports research on reducing inequality in youth outcomes. Now, all too often, our policies in the United States are to hoard opportunities for the advantage instead of extending them to the disadvantage. And this is part of the nefarious comparison of the US to our peer countries. This is especially in tax policies. Mortgage write-offs benefit people who are rich enough to have mortgages. Child care and college savings credits only benefit people who pay taxes that they can get a credit against. Untaxed healthcare benefit people who work in the kind of employment opportunities that offer these benefits. Labor market policies, the lack of family leave. So if you're wealthy enough that you can have one member of your family leave the labor market to care for children when they're babies, then you don't suffer the same from the lack of family leave as a family that can't afford that. Other nations have more inclusive policies in family policy, childcare, health, education, and workforce policies. So the U.S. Exacerbates inequality far worse than many other countries. Now, reducing racial inequality has also been a central focus of our initiative from the outset. Racial inequality in the justice system, in neighborhood and school segregation, in unequal school finance, disparities in child welfare systems, unequal access to mental health services. All of these are areas that we called out specifically when we launched the Reducing Inequality Initiative, and all of these are areas where we have done at least some funding, including by Northwestern scholars who are among our grantees. And this inequality has been exacerbated in the COVID-19 pandemic. The COVID-19 pandemic has brought inequality into even sharper relief. Inequality on the basis of race, ethnicity, and immigration status have all especially been exacerbated, whether it's an unequal access to healthcare, unequal access to education, in person, and especially online education, which takes resources to be set up to profit from it, access to social safety net supports, which are either inaccessible to immigrants or are made more difficult for immigrants to obtain. So therefore, minoritized, immigrant, and low-income populations have all suffered. Probably you all saw the news come out last week of the research study showing that educational achievement test scores suffered during the pandemic, suffered the most for Black and Hispanic populations, in part because they were more likely to be in school systems that moved to completely online, and in part because online schooling during COVID was especially harmful for those populations. So exacerbation of inequality during the COVID period. But COVID is not the only thing that happened in the past 2 years, because simultaneously, we saw an awakening of concerns for racial inequality. Fueled by the furor following the murder of George Floyd, many public institutions began to address anti-Black racism more openly than they had in the past. Symbols, representations, and resources were called out and in many cases actually addressed in the wake of the murder of George Floyd. And this, of course, is the picture of pulling down the statue of Robert E. Lee in Richmond. This has been present in K-12 education, which is always a cultural background in debates over inequality and in American policy more generally. But since then, we've seen a backlash. We've witnessed a backlash against anti-racist efforts in education. Ban critical race theory. Teaching about race, supporters and opponents see vindications. School boards are on new front line in the culture wars. College faculty are fighting back against state bills on critical race theory. In Texas, a battle over what can be taught and what books can be read. Critical race theory bans are making teaching more difficult. So a backlash against the anti-racist efforts that emerged in the wake of the Black Lives Matter protests following the murder of George Floyd. Now, this first emerged during the Trump administration. An executive order from former President Trump banning government agencies, contractors, and grantees from engaging in anti-racist training. And this affected Northwestern as a government grantee, as it did almost all of the grantees of the William T. Grant Foundation. We were very concerned about this. We hold the opposite view of Trump's executive order. Universities should engage in anti-racist education and practice. The past administration's view was anti-science in this realm as it was in so many others. Our view is evidence-based. What evidence am I talking about? Well, historical evidence, the shameful failure to end slavery at the founding of the United States of America, the centrality of slavery in the Southern States Rebellion, the crushing of recent Reconstruction leading to the renewal of white supremacy and Jim Crow laws, or contemporary social science evidence, the generational wealth disparities, systemic racism, including discriminatory bank lending policies, restrictive housing policies, unequal school finance systems, racist criminal justice patterns, and many other aspects of racism. So clearly, anti-racist education is essential for universities and other educative bodies in the United States. And we need universities to do their part. We need research on responses to racial wealth inequality. We need studies of the role of social movements in advancing civil rights. We need research on how teachers can foster students' racial, ethnic identity development. We need to know how to de-escalate police encounters with Black youth. All of these are areas of real research that's ongoing, and many others. In an essay that I wrote on this topic for the Metropolitan Center at New York University, I tried to explain that nothing could be more patriotic than engaging in these kinds of research efforts and in training that would help people understand the importance of this work. Well, if like me, you thought that the matter ended when President Joe Biden was elected, unfortunately, you were wrong, like me. So in October of 2020, I stated, ban anti-racist teaching, that's a terrible idea. See my views here. And then that leads you to an article that says basically what I just said. And then in December of 2020, I said, among the many misguided executive orders, the new POTUS, Joe Biden, should rescind on day one. This ill-informed policy should be on the list. Which ill-informed policy? The Trump executive order on banning anti-racist teaching. And then on January 20th, 2021, I said, revoked by POTUS Joe Biden on day one. Ha! And I did a little victory dance. Well, my victory dance was premature because efforts to limit teaching about race simply shifted from the federal level to state and local levels. Since January 2021, 42 states have proposed and 17 states have adopted new laws or policies that restrict how race and racism are taught in schools. Among these are policies that prevent a negative or critical account of US history, policies that require schools to refrain from exploring the idea that American institutions have inherent biases, and policies that avoid divisive topics that may make students feel uncomfortable on account of their racial identity. I would assert, I am asserting, that if students are not feeling uncomfortable, you're probably not doing a good job of teaching the history of the United States. If you cannot teach a critical account of US history, you are not teaching the history of the United States. If you cannot explore the idea that there are inherent biases in American institutions, you are ignoring the facts, the evidence that I presented to you a few moments ago. Meanwhile, the William T. Grant Foundation continues to support research on reducing racial inequality in education. Examples include research by psychologists, economists, and sociologists that focus on interactions among teachers and students, racial knowledge, racial competence, racial identity. And as stated by our grantee, Adriana Umania Taylor, in a meeting I attended just a few days ago. Whoops, what did I do? Without an, can I make this go away? Thank you. Without an explicit focus on racial, ethnic, and identity in school, we will not reduce ethno-racial disparities in education because these disparities are, in fact, about race. Some examples of studies that we are currently supporting on reducing racial inequality that may fall afoul of the new state and local efforts to ban anti-racist teaching. Can ethnic studies courses reduce racial inequality as they scale? So you may know that the state of California has mandated ethnic studies on a statewide basis. It's been alive in several of the major school districts for some time. And in a mixed method study in partnership with the Los Angeles, San Francisco, and Albuquerque school districts, this study examines the impact of ethnic studies on reducing inequality, the pedagogy that supports success, and how school districts can recruit teachers for ethnic study courses. And that's Emily Penner at UC Irvine. Another example, Deborah Rivas-Drake from Michigan's study of school programs for social emotional learning typically ask students to conform. What if instead they promoted ethnic racial identities and social justice concerns? What if we taught students to be critical and to develop their social emotional skills in that manner instead of sitting down and shutting up? What would that mean for racial inequality? Or Adriana's study, I just mentioned Adriana, can teachers learn to promote students' racial ethnic identity, and will that reduce ethnic disparity, academic disparities? Or a study by June An, also at UC Irvine, on intentional dialogue and relational processes in research practice partnerships to facilitate evidence use and improvements in anti-racist outcomes. Colleen Halliday at the Medical College of South Carolina is studying whether teacher training to address unconscious bias, racial bias, can improve African-American students' academic and behavioral outcomes. And we are funding research by Sandy Darity at Duke University to examine the feasibility and practicality of reparations for Black American descendants of enslaved persons. How would reparations work? How much is owed, and who would pay? A major component of this study is a K-12 outreach component. So how will that fare in North Carolina in light of the racial backlash that we're facing? So our grantees have used a variety of strategies to navigate these rough waters of polarization. So the first thing to talk about is partnerships, which I'm arguing are the antidote to polarization. The research practice partnership, such as you've established here at Northwestern with the Evanston school districts, are ongoing sustained relationships between a university and a local school district or a state education agency or a collection of school districts, in which the ongoing relationship promotes trust and shared understandings. And that gives an opportunity to develop the kind of sensibility, mutual sensibility and mutuality that can allow work to persist even in light of efforts coming from outside. For example, the partnership with the school district in Albuquerque, New Mexico that I mentioned that's studying ethnic studies courses has been able to continue despite the fraught political environment of Albuquerque. Research practice partnerships also allow predictability. So you're not going to spring on your partners some research findings. You're going to let them know about it in advance, let them figure out how to deal with it before it comes out, to try to avoid some of the political challenges that may emerge from the research. And the research practice partnership is a two-way street. This is not about researchers telling things to educators. This is about researchers and educators learning together. Crucially, the questions are those that are of interest to the educators. And so there's a much greater chance, if the research is pursuing questions that are of interest to the educators, much greater chance that the research findings will actually be used to influence policy and practice. And if the educators have a chance to help shape the research, then there's a greater chance of avoiding the challenges that come with our polarized climate. A second strategy that our grantees are using is to expand or contract the visibility of the research studies depending on the context. So in some cases of our grantees, they're finding that school district staff, the teachers, educational leaders are very invested in these anti-racist programs, training teachers to mitigate bias, for example, or programs to help children develop their racial and ethnic identity. The district officials and the teachers are committed to this, as they were before George Floyd, as they were after George Floyd, and as they continue to be today. But they're all laboring in a polarized environment, so they continue this work without bringing it the kind of visibility that it might have otherwise had, and that is enabling them to continue on with the work. A third key point that our grantees have made to us is about the importance of understanding the social and cultural context. So, you're not going to pop down into South Carolina and do the same kind of work that you could do in Massachusetts. To understand the social and cultural context and interact with your school district partners with that context in mind. Yet another point that our grantees are making is to focus on student identity development. Here I'll bring to mind the recent report from the National Academy of Sciences on the promise of adolescence, realizing opportunity for all youth, which focuses on racial and ethnic identity development. One other of our grantees said that she's going to move her anti-racist education efforts out of the schools and into an after-school setting. Now, the upside to this is then you leave the school board out of the picture and you don't get their polarized context. The downside is, of course, the people coming to after school are people who volunteer to go to after school, people who choose to go to after school. So if you're doing this in the public school, then you have the whole population. If you're doing this in the after school setting, you have a select population. So there are trade-offs to that response. Now, what is the role of the university or the school or college within the university in supporting research in a polarized context? I think we can see that it is an opportunity to stand up for the importance of research on racism and racial equality. And we need university leaders and individual faculty members to stand up and to get behind and to be vocal about the importance of this work, to validate the work of the work that's going on, and to validate their colleagues who are engaging in this work. Our grantees have spoken about the value of training for researchers to speak with news media in a polarized climate. So you're carrying out research on racial equity. What will you do when the newspaper comes to talk to you and asks if you're bringing CRT, if you're bringing critical race theory into the school? How will you respond? So universities can provide training to their staff to respond to those situations. One of the biggest challenges that our grantees have told us about that they're facing in this polarized environment is institutional review boards have become hypersensitive to research on race. And so we can provide training for our IRBs that specifically addresses these challenges, puts it in the appropriate context for social science research, which is a minimal, almost invariably a minimal risk context, and help the IRB understand it. We at the foundation are looking into the possibility of working with a national organization that trains IRB professionals for the same purpose. And what about the role of funders that support research on race, racism, and reducing racial inequality? So again, we too have a responsibility to express and contribute to counter messaging, to articulating the importance of research on race and racism. Why, especially now, we should be pursuing this. We shouldn't be backing away from it out of fear of stirring up controversy. We should be wading into it. We should be leaning into it for exactly that reason. Systemic racism is real and well documented, and we need research to identify ways to overturn the structural basis of inequality and systemic racism. We can also support district and community partners to engage in partnership-oriented research. So traditionally, what we've done is to support the researchers, but we may be able to do more. There may be more we can do to support the partners in their efforts to collaborate with the researchers and in ways that help buffer them from the challenges that they face in a polarized time. We can also allow flexibility with researcher timelines to allow researchers to adjust to changing political climates. This is an easy lift for us. We've done this routinely. I mean, we always had a pretty flexible policy with regard to a no-cost extension. We are soon going to be announcing an opportunity for our grantees to get not no-cost extension, meaning extensions with possibility of additional funding, because navigating this political climate is challenging, and if it takes you longer to do your research, but you got to keep your staff employed, then you may need more funding to do that. So we're looking at that as well. Encountering resistance to advances in racial equity is not an unfamiliar experience. I saw so much written in the news media and on social media, which projected an experience of despair at the backlash that anti-racist efforts have engendered. And my message is, this is not a time for despair. Racial equity advances have always engendered backlash. All great efforts to advance justice in the United States have faced backlash. This is no reason to lose hope. Rather, it is time to bear down. Inequality growth is not inevitable. Hopefully, I've convinced you of that. And reducing racial inequality requires political will and research-based knowledge. Now, how can you join the William T. Grant Foundation in pursuing these efforts? Well, I have good news. We have grant-making programs, and we invite you to apply to them. And I'll spend my last few minutes telling you about the funding opportunities at the William T. Grant Foundation, where you can pursue research on reducing inequality and youth outcomes and on improving the use of evidence from research in policy and practice. I'll talk about 3 types of grants: our major research grants, our William T. Grant Scholars Grants, and our Institutional Challenge Grant. And I can tell you that Northwestern University has already been successful in all 3 of these categories. So there are local resources you can draw upon to hear more about them. We support high quality research to ensure that young people from diverse backgrounds reach their fullest potential. So the major research grants. These are grants that typically range between $100,000 and $600,000. They typically span 2 to 3 years. And to compete for these grants, first of all, you have to be looking at one of our 2 focus areas: reducing inequality in youth outcomes, or improving the use of research evidence in policy and practice. And applying is a 2-phase process. The first phase is a letter of inquiry. It's a 5-page letter of inquiry. It's a relatively easy lift, or it's not that burdensome to do a 5-page letter of inquiry. We have 3 deadlines per year. The next deadline is in the first week of August. The one after that will be in January. The one after that will be in May. And within 4 to 6 weeks, you will hear back. It is reviewed internally with regard to our interests and our funding criteria. The letters of inquiry that are best judged with regard to those criteria receive an invitation to submit a full proposal. About 15% of the letters of inquiry generate an invitation to submit a full proposal. The full proposal is then reviewed externally and then back again by our team. And the most favorably reviewed of the full proposals then go back to the grantee with an opportunity to respond to criticisms raised by the external reviewers. And we pull all that together internally and make recommendations to our board of trustees, who make their decisions 3 times a year. That's the major research grants. Second, the William T. Grant Scholars Program. Currently, Mesmin Destin is a William T. Grant Scholar, and Simone Espalanda is a William T. Grant Scholar. I see Emma Adam in the audience, a former William T. Grant Scholar. I believe there have been others, maybe some others who are here. Edith Chen has been a William T. Grant Scholar. So long record of success here at Northwestern with the William T. Grant Scholars Program. The Scholars Award is not a grant to do a specific piece of research. It is a career development award. To be eligible, you need to be within 7 years of the PhD, and you can't just apply for the Scholars Award. You have to be nominated by your institution, and each major division of an institution, meaning a college or a school, may nominate only 1 candidate per year. So many institutions have internal competitions before deciding on their nominee. The application process was announced for 2022 was announced just a few weeks ago. The deadline is July, but it's a very involved application with a lot of parts. So if you're going to have a William T. Grant Scholar applicant this year, now is the time to get started with that. The award provides $350,000 over 5 years, and the institution has to promise that you will be required to do only 50% teaching for those 5 years. So it's a great boon to the emerging scholar. Now, a key feature of the William T. Grant Scholars Award as a career development award is breaking out into some new area, whether it's a methodological stretch or taking on mastering some new area of content to complement your already considerable expertise. So for many early career researchers, the most important thing you can do is keep doing what you're doing, just do more of it faster. That may be very good advice. That's not what the Scholars Program is for. The Scholars Program is for early career scholars who are already finding a lot of success and need to add on some new area of expertise, what we call the stretch. And to aid you in this new area of expertise, then you identify one or two mentors who are experts in that area who can support your career development. So the guidelines are put, well, it says December, actually, February. Guidelines came out in February, and the application deadline is in July. Here were the 2022 awards that were just announced about 3 weeks ago. Sophia Rodriguez at Maryland for research on educational success and social inclusion of recently arrived Central American immigrant students. Nilufar Salehi from Berkeley, leveraging community participation, developed school assignment algorithms. She's a computer scientist. Teresa Stewart Ambo at UC San Diego on native nation building and the educational outcomes of American Indian youth. Abigail Weitzman is a demographer at UT Austin, how immigration laws and enforcement policies shape Latino adolescents' experiences and outcomes. And Diedrich Williams from the University of Tennessee, a sociologist studying structural mechanisms that maintain the racial stratification of poverty. So you can see sociologists, psychologists. We often have economists, but I guess not this year, but we do have a computer scientist, so very cross-disciplinary, all looking at building their careers towards the ability to identify ways to reduce inequality. Finally, the Institutional Challenge Grant. Here, the goal is to bridge research, policy, and practice. Research organizations link with policy or practice partner organizations to address issues of youth inequality, develop the capacity of researchers and partners by pursuing a joint research agenda and creating institutional change to value partnership work. And this grant provides 3 years of $650,000 with a possible 2-year renewal. So ultimately $1 million over 5 years. Provides funds for planning for research fellows to carry out the research agenda. Researchers who address policy and practice issues, and policy and practice staff use research evidence in their decision-making. A key element here is to reshape the incentive structure within the university to value partnership-oriented engaged scholarship. The announcement came out just a couple of weeks ago, and the deadline is in September. Northwestern is one of the 12 institutions that already has an Institutional Challenge Grant. David Figlio is the PI, and it's in the School of Education, but there's no limit. You could apply for another one. And in fact, 2 of the finalists this year were from one institution, although only one of them won it, but could have gone 2 institutions for the same year. We had 3 winners this year. Oh, so the Institutional Challenge Grant calls on universities to build a partnership with a public agency or nonprofit organization, jointly develop a research agenda, and provide fellows to carry out the research agenda. 2/3 of the cost of the fellows comes from the grant, 1/3 comes from the university. Build the capacity of the agency to use evidence in its decision-making and reshape incentives for faculty to support engagement. So the 3 winners of the 2022 competition were the University of Michigan in partnership with Focus Hope in Detroit on reducing stress and improving workforce development to promote racial and economic justice. Florida State University in partnership with Leon County Schools and Florida A&M University, the #1 public historically black college or university in the country, to reduce racial disparities in reading and other areas of education. And finally, Georgia State University in partnership with Achieve Atlanta to reduce racial, ethnic, and economic disparities in the financing and completion of higher education. So I'd love to take your questions about anything that I've spoken about pursuing research on racial equity in a polarized time, or about pursuing funds from the William T. Grant Foundation to support your work. I would conclude by saying we're at a critical point for research on racial equity. Our understanding of the sources of inequality is stronger than ever, but we need to develop and test new ideas for reducing inequality. Research, universities, educators, and funders must fulfill this mandate together. The backlash is not a cause for despair, but a reason for resolve. Thank you.